Let's start with a really tough question. What would you do if a voice you believed was God commanded you to kill a defenseless person? Well, today we're diving into a controversial ancient account where that exact thing happens. And we're going to unpack the complex legal and ethical arguments used to justify an act that, on the surface, looks like a pretty open and shut case of murder.
So I want you to imagine this. Put yourself in Jerusalem around 600 BCE. You're walking down a dark street, and you stumble upon your family's biggest enemy, and he's passed out drunk. And then you hear that voice, the one you're convinced is divine, and it tells you to end his life. That is the exact dilemma at the heart of our story, a moment of incredible conflict for a young man named Nephi.
And the thing is, before any of this goes down, the text makes it incredibly clear that Nephi is horrified by this command. I mean, look at this quote. He says he's never killed anyone, and his immediate gut reaction is just, no way. He shrinks from the idea. This really deep personal hesitation is what makes the final outcome so shocking.
Right, so how in the world does a man who's never shed blood end up here, standing over his unconscious enemy, Laban, with a sword in his hand?
Well, for starters, this wasn't some planned ambush or an act of revenge. The record is super specific on this point. It says Nephi was led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand what he was going to do. He just finds Laban, totally helpless, in what the text presents as a kind of divinely orchestrated coincidence.
Now, to really get a handle on what happens next, we have to understand the history between these two men. Laban wasn't just some random guy. He was a powerful and, according to this record, a deeply corrupt official in Jerusalem. So let's open up the case file.
The whole conflict escalated over 3 different attempts to get a set of sacred records called the brass plates. As you can see from this timeline, attempt 1 was just a simple request. And Laban's response? He threatens to kill Nephi's brother, Laman. So for attempt 2, they try a business deal, offering their entire family fortune for the plates. Laban just steals their property and sends his men to murder them. Each one of these encounters shows us more and more about Laban's violent character and his complete disregard for the law.
So yeah, the text isn't painting Laban as just a tough adversary, it's painting him as a straight-up criminal who had already committed multiple serious, even capital crimes under the law of his day. I mean, look at this list. He's a false accuser, a thief, and an attempted murderer. Now this is where it gets really fascinating. The story presents a very specific legal defense for what Nephi does. And this defense is rooted in the ancient law of Moses, their society's legal code. And it all hinges on a key distinction from the Book of Exodus.
This legal distinction is absolutely crucial. See, under this code, not all killing is treated the same. There's a huge difference between plotting to kill someone, that's murder with guile, and a situation the law describes as God delivering someone into another's hand. One meant a death sentence, the other, you'd have to flee to a place of safety. So when we apply this legal framework to Nephi's situation, the narrative argues it's a perfect fit. First, was it premeditated? The text hammers this point home. Nope. He had no idea this was going to happen. Second, was Laban divinely delivered? The spiritual voice explicitly tells him this twice. So based on these 2 points, the act is framed not as murder, but as a divinely sanctioned killing under this very specific law.
But here's the kicker. What happens when we turn that same legal lens back onto Laban himself for what he did before this night?
Okay, so get this. The law of Moses had a very specific rule for bearing false witness. The principle was essentially life for life, eye for eye. In short, you suffer the exact penalty you tried to inflict on somebody else. Laban falsely accused Laman and tried to have him killed. By doing that, under the laws of his own society, Laban had already committed an offense that was worthy of death. In a very real legal sense, his life was already forfeit.
But we're still left with the biggest question of all. Why? I mean, even if the act could be justified within this ancient framework, why was it deemed necessary? Well, the justification offered goes way beyond individual justice, to something much, much bigger.
This quote right here, this is the core motive presented in the text. It's a really stark, almost utilitarian argument, the life of one guilty man versus the spiritual and cultural survival of an entire future nation.
So why was a whole nation at stake? Because those brass plates, a set of metal records, they weren't just valuable artifacts. They were basically the blueprint for their civilization. They had the laws, the language, their family history, everything. The text argues that without these records, Nephi's descendants would lose their identity and their entire civilization would just dwindle and perish.
So if we look at the internal logic of the story, Nephi's action is framed not as murder, but as a kind of legal, divinely commanded execution. It's portrayed as an unpremeditated act, carried out on a man who was already condemned under his own laws, and for a purpose that was seen as being much greater than one man's life, the very survival of a people.
In the end, the story of Nephi and Laban, even though it's rooted in an ancient world with its own unique moral code, leaves us with a provocative ethical question. It's that classic, deeply uncomfortable dilemma of the one versus the many, a problem that societies are still wrestling with today. So I'll leave you with this to think about. If you were in Nephi's shoes, what would you have done?